Hello all, welcome to the quantifier. So continuing our streak for RC99, we are here with the passage number 2. So I hope that you all have solved this passage before going through this particular video. So let's go ahead with this passage. So Henry Warnham Poor, let me just start with the annotation here. Just a second, guys. Yeah. Okay. So Henry Warnham Poor, editor of American Railroad Journal, drew the important elements of the image of railroad together in 1851. Look at the results of this masterpiece material progress, the vigor, life, and the executive energy that follow in its train, rapidly succeeded by wealth, the refinement and intellectual cultural of high civilization. All this is typified in a degree by a locomotive, the combination in its construction of nice art and scientific application of power, its speed surpassing that of the proudest courser, and its immense strength are all characteristics of our age and tendency to us. Like the telegraph, it is essential, it constitutes a part of our nature. It is a condition of being what we are. Okay. So basically, what we can summarize, it's an easy to read paragraph. So we know that in the very first paragraph, the author describes the opinion of, let's say, one of the editor of the American Railroad Journal. Okay, so basically, the first paragraph is describing the opinion of Henry Warner Poor. Okay, and he says that it is good. So he's writing everything positive about the railroads, right? So he said that look at the result of this material progress, the vigor, life, the executive energy, okay, and succeeded by wealth, the refinement and intellectual cultural or culture of high civilization. Okay, so it's all that what we can figure is that it is describing the opinion of one railroad promoter, that is this guy Poor, okay, and who considered the railroad as a progressive nature for the American character. And and more like this, he is kind of drawing an analogical relationship that to us, like the telegraph, it is essential as it constitutes a part of our nature. Okay, so let's see what's there in this para number 2. So in the third decade of the 19th century, Americans began to define their character in light of the new railroads. Okay, so Americans, they define their characters in light of the new railroads. They like the idea that it took special people to foresee and capitalize on the promise of science. Railroad promoters, using the steam engine as a metaphor for what they thought Americans were and what they thought Americans were becoming, frequently discussed parallels between the locomotive and the national character, pointing out that both possessed youth, power, speed, single-mindedness, and bright prospects. Okay, so basically, again, it is author is seen to be all praising or laudatoring the railroads. Okay, so it's again a positive in tone. So it describes the American idea of the time that the railroad basically defines their character. Okay, so they started defining their character in the light of the new railroads. So it's again positive. So Americans were really proud of it. Okay, and they believe that the railroad reflected elements of the American character. Now, Poor was, of course, promoting acceptance of railroads and enticing his readers to open their pocketbooks. But his metaphors had their dark side. Now, let's see, okay? So, this guy was kind of promoting the acceptance of railroads, but there were some problems with it. So, but obvious in the coming things, the author will going to talk about what were the issues. So, a locomotive was quite unlike anything Americans had ever seen. It was large, mysterious, and dangerous. Many thought that it was a monster waiting to devour the unwary. Okay, there was a suspicion that a country founded upon Jeffersonian agrarian principles had bought a ticket and boarded a train pulled by some iron monster into the dark recess of an unknown future. Okay, so basically what we know is that the para 1 and the para 2, they were all positive. Okay, but then there was some darker side to it. And what was the darker side? That it is basically related to the fears associated with the railroads. Okay, and for example, let's say they were saying that for some Americans, okay, it was kind of a large, mysterious, and dangerous, like a monster. Okay, and they were kind of worrying that it will gonna take them away from the Jeffersonian agrarian principles. Okay, into the dark recess of an unknown future. So a recess is kind of a, you can say, a small space that is created inside a wall, okay, when constructing it. So sometimes kind of a hollow kind of a thing, okay. Now, to ease such public comprehensions, promoters, poets, editors, writers alike adopted the notion that locomotives were really only iron horses, an early metaphor that lingered because it made steam technology ordinary and understandable. Iron horse metaphors assuaged fears about inherent defects in the national character, promoting images of a more secure future, and made an alien technology less frightening and even comforting and congenial. So basically, what they say is that para 3 basically talks about the fears associated with the railroads, okay, and the Paraphor basically talks about the metaphor about the iron horses and how it actually help the people counter their fear of the rails. Okay, so they say that to ease such public apprehension, everybody from promoters to poets to editors to writers, okay, they started making this metaphor of an iron horse, okay, and then it kind of release or assuages reduce the impact of something, okay, so it assuages the fears about inherent defects in the national character, and it promote the images of a secure feature. So they were again, the author went into the positive side. Now, essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson saw the locomotive as an agent of domestic harmony. Now, this guy was a very famous guy, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So he saw the locomotive as an agent of domestic harmony. He observed that the locomotive and the steamboat, like enormous shuttle, shoot every day across the thousand various threads of national descent and employment and bind them fast in one web. Adding an hourly assimilation goes far forward, and there is no danger that local peculiarities and hostilities should be preserved. To us Americans, it seems to have fallen as a political aid. We could not else have held the vast North American together, which we now engage to do. Okay, so basically, it describes the opinion of one of the essayists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it describes the way that American are like this railroads, okay, has brought this domestic harmony, okay, and he observed that the locomotive and the steamboat, like enormous shuttles, shoot every day across the thousands various threads of national descent and employment and bind them. So it's kind of a harmony. The railways act as a binding force. It kind of generates an employment, okay. Adding an hourly assimilation goes forward, and there is no danger that local peculiarities and hostility should be preserved. To us American, it seems to have fallen as a political aid. We could not else have held this vast North American together, which we now engage to do. So again, a positive thing. So overall, in case if I have to talk about the idea of this particular passage, okay, so it's about the railroads, okay, and how the Americans are really proud of it. They say that it actually defines their character. No doubt that there are little apprehensions and the people are suspicion about it, okay, but then everybody in the society is doing something to ease their apprehensions, and later, this guy is considering that the locomotive is an agent of a domestic harmony. So, overall, an easy passage to comprehend. I hope that while comprehending this passage won't have been much troublesome to you, wouldn't have given you much trouble. So, without wasting much time, let's get into the questions. Now, which of the following claims the author of the passage most agree with? Okay, so this is the agreement question. So, we have to see that the author in the passage was totally positive about the railroad. So any such claim that is fortifying the railroads, we're gonna give the credit to this particular uh, credentials in this particular passage. Now, the railroad undermined Americans' progressive tendencies. Now, this is totally opposite. Okay, undermined is weaken. So, weaken, we can see that the author's tone in the entire passage was a positive tone. Okay, so that is the case. So, author argues that the railroad reflected the progressive tendencies. Okay, they define their character and all that thing. So, this is cannot be the answer. Railroad promoters like Poor denounced Jeffersonian agrarian principles. Now, where this guy poor was mentioned here, okay? The Jeffersonian was this guy was being mentioned here, okay? There, the agrarian principles had bought a ticket on boarded a train pulled by some. So they say this guy was mentioned because what the people were suspicion about. So there was a suspicion that a country founded upon Jeffersonian agrarian principles had bought a ticket and boarded a train pulled by some iron monster into the dark recess of an unknown future. So they say that ours is an agriculture economy, and this train has pulled by some iron, and this is throwing us in some sort of a space, okay, where the future is not predicted, okay. But this railroad promoter is like poor, he denounced Jeffersonian agrarian principle. This is not mentioned, okay. So this is a distortion of the idea. So American was suspicious that the railroad contradicted Jeffersonian principles, but there are no indication that this guy denounced this principle. So hence it cannot be the answers. Now the Americans, it should be Americans, okay, in general were against the railroad. So this is opposite, okay. This runs counter to the point made in the para number 2. They say that Americans began to define their character in the light of the new railroads. Okay, they like the idea that it took spatial people to capitalize in the promise of science. Okay, and then do no doubt that it was mentioned here that they were sort of suspicion about the railroad. Okay, but then again, everybody from promoters to poets to editors to writers, okay, they did their part to ease this apprehensions. Okay, and they say that it is a kind of a iron horse because it links steam technology ordinary and all that. And later on also this guy, okay, he say that it brings about the domestic harmony and so on. So this is not the case in general. No, not in general, okay. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson thought that the railroad would harm America. Oh, this is a suicide option. So he's kind of a all positive, okay? So he said that the locomotives is an agent of the domestic harmony. Enormous shuttle shoot every day across the various set of national descent, employment, bind them fast. Okay, it has fallen as a political aid. Okay, so all these things is very positive about it. Americans generally supported the development of the railroad. This is actually your correct answer. Okay. Now, what is the case is that the passage itself is a straightforward. You need to understand what was the author's main claim. So we know that the author was all positive about the railroad. So any such particular claim that gives you a positive opinion about the railroad, the author would definitely agree to it. Okay. So the passage, the railroad reflected the American character. Okay, and despite a few misgivings, Americans were like everybody contributed towards the positive of it. They were saying they were working to ease such apprehensions. This famous essays. He also said that it was an agent of domestic harmony. So Americans generally supported the development of the railroad. I hope now you are able to get this particular question. So let's see the question number 2. So the passage is primarily concerned with which of the following? Okay. So the you know that in case if before going to the question also in case if we know, so we know that the passage broadly describes the early years of the railroad and its impact on American character, and it's all positive. Okay, so let's see, criticize one interpretation of the early American railroads. Okay, so the passage is primarily concerned with which of the following is a kind of a main idea of the question. Okay, and the main idea was that author was kind of glorifying the American railroads. Okay, so criticize one interpretation of the early American railroads. Where is he even criticizing one interpretation of the American railroads? Okay, so he's not doing that. The author never criticizes anything, so this cannot be the answer. Discusses the early years of the railroads and its connection to the American character of the time. This is absolutely the perfect answer. Okay, so let's see. Drew the important elements of the image of the railroad together in 1851. Okay, then Americans began to define their character in the light of the new railroads. Okay, so all these things they were apprehension, but then everybody again they say that it is a kind of an iron horse. Okay, and then they say that it shoot every day and bind them fast. Okay, political aid. So all this suggests that It discusses the early years of the railroad and its connection to the American character of the time. Now, suggests that the railroads were the most important development in the history of America. Now, this is not the case, okay? Most important makes this as an extreme. Remember, for the main idea question, I gave you this technique of a paint. So, most important makes it extreme. And moreover, you can say here, no, that to us, like the telegraph, it is essential. So it is not the most important, it is just like the telegraph. So that is the reason that C cannot be the answer. Describe the apprehension with which most of the Americans greeted the early railroads. Okay. Now, the problem here again is the two of the problem. First is most of the American were not apprehension. Okay. Were not apprehensive. Let's see here. Okay, this para talks about the apprehension. That Poor was, of course, promoting acceptance of the railroad, enticing his readers to open their pocketbooks, but his metaphors had their dark sides. A locomotive was quite like anything Americans had ever seen. It was large, mysterious, and dangerous. Many thought that it was a monster waiting to devour the unwary. There was a suspicion that a country founded upon this. Okay. So many, again, many does not means most, first of all. Okay. Now, secondly, describe the apprehension with most of the Americans greeted the early railroads. This is very narrower as an answer, okay? So only one paragraph of the passage talks about the apprehension, but the rest of the other passage, this guy was positive. The Americans begin to feel that they define their character. Then everybody, promoters, poet, editors, writers, okay, they started showing the railroads in a positive manner. Okay, then this guy again, he say that it's kind of act as a domestic harmony, binding the nation together. So to say that most of the Americans greeted the early railroads with an apprehension is slightly a distortion of the facts. Okay, and secondly, the problem is that the question is asking you the passage is primarily concerned. So primarily concerned is basically something that is present in the passage from the beginning till the end. Here is only one paragraph that is talking about the apprehension. So the in fact, immediate next to this particular paragraph is talking about how these apprehensions were being eased. Okay, so that is the case that this cannot be the answer. Now, assert that Americans were tricked into believing that railroads were beneficial to them. Now, again, this is a distortion of the facts. The Americans were never tricked into believing anything. Okay. So, what this thing, no, the promoters, the poets, the editors, and the writers alike adopted the notion that locomotives were really only iron horses. So this is to ease such public apprehensions. Okay, so they were being manipulative or something like that is not mentioned in the passage. Okay, so they were what they were this assert that Americans were tricked into believing that the railroads were beneficial. No, they were just easing the public comprehensions. Okay, and there was also, of course, promoting the acceptance of the railroads. Okay, so he was promoting and enticing his readers. So, but tricked into believing is again a very extreme as an answer. Okay, they were never tricked into believing. They were merely trying to ease public apprehensions. Okay, and not deceive them so that they get more open to this particular technology. So by that logic, the option number B is the correct answer. And again, we need to see, no, that this particular option E is a tone mismatch. So again, the tone of the entire passage was a positive. So we need to figure out the answer that is a positive tone here. Now, according to the passage, which of the following is most likely to be true about Ralph Waldo Emerson's beliefs? So we know that this guy was being mentioned in the last paragraph. Okay, so what we know is that the Emerson believed that the locomotive is a kind of a act as an agent of a domestic harmony. It kept the nation together. Let me just drag on this thing here. So to us American, okay, it helps them bind them together. It keeps the nation together. Okay, it has fallen as a political aid, and so North America together. So that was the views of it. So look for the answer choice that has this kind of a unity or the binding element in it. Okay, now let's see. He felt that Americans should adhere strictly to Jeffersonian agrarian principles. Now, this is like something given here and being molded into this. So this is a faulty use of details. So Jeffersonian principles are mentioned in the previous paragraphs. Okay, so it was being mentioned here, where the people were apprehensive that it will gonna take their country away from the Jeffersonian agrarian principles, and they don't know where this train will going to take them into a dark recess of an unknown future. Okay, but what is this like? Whether he'll gonna agree that he felt that the Americans should adhere strictly. In case if he believed that this should be the case, then he would not have given this particular railways in a positive manner. Okay, so that is the case. It is a kind of a distortion. Okay, there's nothing to suggest that he thought that there should be any sort of adherence to them or not. So that not the answer. He thought that the railroad was as important as the telegraph. Okay, okay, it was being mentioned here. So this was Henry Wondam poor view. Okay, to us, like the telegraph, it is essential. So this was this guy view. Okay, this was not a Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was all about unity, binding, and all the case. Okay, so that is the case. So again, not the answer. Now he felt that technological process would help to unify Americans. Yes, I told you, okay, that we're looking for that particular option that ties into this unity part, okay, that he's being highlighted here, and which is very well done by the option number C. Now, he thought that the railroad promoters were acting against Americans' best interest. Now, if Emerson favored the railroad, okay, it follows that he would also be more likely to approve of rather than condemn railroad promoters. So his view, again, we can see that the essay is Ralph Waldo Emerson's view on the locomotive agent was all positive. Okay, so since it was all positive, so how can he gonna say that the railroad promoters were acting against? So he has a positive view, so he'll gonna definitely support those people who has the positive view. Okay, so that is the case. So he thought that the railroad promoters were acting against. No, that's not a case. Okay, so he has a positive view, so it should be go. His metaphors had a dark side to them. This was not the Emerson case. Okay, this dark side was being mentioned here. So Poor was of course promoting acceptance of railroads and enticing his readers to open their pocketbooks, but his metaphors had their dark side. So his metaphors, the Poor's metaphor has the dark side, not Emerson. So anyhow, the C is the best answer for this question. Okay, I hope you understand this question. Now let's get into the last question of the passage. Suppose that in early 19th century, American inventor had developed a device that made it easier to construct multi-story building. How would early 19th century, so this is 1851, early 19th Americans be expected to react to this invention? Okay, so now this particular question is kind of, you can say, a critical reasoning based question, okay, or an interpretation question based. So you have to, your understanding of the passage, and then you have to apply it to some new ideas presented. So a little bit of the reasoning is required here, okay. So what we can figure out from this particular passage is that the situation involves a scientific progress, okay, which the scientific progress is a railroad, okay. And what was the Americans' opinions about this scientific progress? What does the author say about the Americans' ideas about it? So they say that in the third decade of the 19th century, so it's also talking about the 19th century, okay, early 19th century. So in the third decade of the early 19th century, Americans began to define their character in the light of new railroads, okay. They like the idea that it took special people to foresee and capitalize on the promise of science. Okay. So railroad promoters using the steam engine as a metaphor for what they thought Americans were and what they thought Americans were becoming frequently discussed parallels between the locomotive and the national character, pointing out that this, and bright prospects. Okay. So that is the case. So Americans' view about anything that has a scientific progress, okay, is positive. So by this idea from the passage, okay, that we can figure out that the American has some sort of liking or fondness for the science, okay. So anything that will gonna improve or that will gonna, let's say, work on the science, okay, will be accepted in a positive manner, okay. So this is what is the one inference that you need to draw here to answer this particular question. So suppose that in early 19th century, American inventor had developed a device that made it easier to construct multi-story buildings. So developed a device that made it easier to construct a multi-story building. then probably the 19th century Americans would react in a positive manner because they have this something liking for the promise of science. They believe that it actually foresee and capitalized on the promise of science and it had got bright prospects. Okay, so that is the case. So anything that is positive will be the case. Again, going by the tone, aspects of the passage, it needs to be the positive, but a little bit of the inferences needs to be drawn here. Your reasoning skills needs to be brought here. So they would not support society's use of such device. Now this is opposite, okay, because the tone is the positive. So American public at that time would have supported anything which is a scientific progress or which is built on the promise of the science. So hence cannot be the answer. Now they would generally support society's use of such a device. That is generally a case, okay, because support, they'll be positive about it. They would have no opinion about the society's use of such a device. The author indicates that they have a favorable opinion towards the promise of the science and they want to capitalize on the promise of the sign and they consider it as a bright prospect. So they will not gonna have no opinion, will not be the case, okay. Though they themselves would not use such a device, again the answer choice does not deal with the reaction looked for by the question, okay. The question is that how would early 19th century Americans be expected to react, okay. So they themselves would not use such a device. Now, can you see here, in case if I say, or let's consider the fifth also, they would initially view such a device with skepticism, okay? So again, there are a couple of things. Let's talk about the option number E first of all. So this or this D, okay? The A or let's say A, D, and E, okay? So A, D, and E kind of saying the same thing. And my question to you is that suppose in case if you pick up this particular option number A, that is they would not support society's use of such a device. Okay. So this option they themselves would not use such a device. Okay. So again, they are kind of almost similar to each other. So when you say that I've opted for option number A, my question to you will be why not option number D? Okay. So they would not support society's use of such a device. They themselves would not use such a device. So when they don't want the society to use the device, so they can advocate only when they are themselves not using it. Okay. So again, this is kind of similar. Okay. So two options that are almost similar cannot be your answer by that logic. Now, E option, they would initially view such a device with skepticism. Okay, but then again, there was a problem. See, this is a interpretation based question, but the interpretation based question again needs to have some sort of linkages from the passage. And what was the linkages? Now here, again, this particular part, no, this particular, not every Americans were apprehensive about the acceptance of the railroads, okay? In case if that would have been the case, why would this promoters, poets, editors, and writers alike, okay? Why this essayist, okay? So it was not the case, okay? So maybe, let's say, many of them were suspicion, but that does not mean that the entire Americans were being suspicious about it, okay? So that is a case that they would initially view such a device with skepticism. So this cannot be inferred, okay, that initially they would view with skepticism or not that, okay. So one such case where we cannot have a single of the doubts because of this particular paragraph and the capitalize on the promise of the site, we can see that the second is a B is the better answer to it, that they would generally support society's use of such a device, okay. So by this thing, we are done with the passage number 2 on RC99. In case of any queries, please feel free to contact. Okay. So yeah, happy learning. Enjoy your day. Stay safe. Okay. And study. Thank you.